The Imperium stretches endlessly across the stars, the cathedral of stone, metal, and devotion that pierces the heavens. Towering hive cities climb miles into the sky, their spires bristling with sanctuaries, fortresses, and the ever-watchful eyes of the Ecclesiarchy. At the center of it all stands the Emperor, the one true guiding light, not merely a ruler, but the axis around which loyalty, law, and faith revolve. To worship him is to obey, to endure, and to survive. Yet within this devotion lies a perilous tension. The line between piety and heresy is thin, ever-shifting, and invisible until crossed. In the shadowed corridors of Hive Tarsus, a lone devotee kneels, head bowed beneath the curling smoke of incense, acrid and sharp, rising like spectral serpents through the air. The scent is familiar, sacred, yet suffocating. It carries both solace and warning. The low thrum of ritual drums vibrates through stone floors, echoing in the marrow of those who dare to kneel too long, whispering the litany in a cadence that is both hypnotic and dangerous. Candlelight dances across gilded statues, the Emperor's eyes glowing with an inner fire that seems to pierce the soul, reading devotion, desire, and doubt alike. Every gesture, every tremor of the hands clutching prayer beads, betrays a delicate tension. Faith, in its most potent form, is a force that pushes and pulls, drawing one closer to sanctity or nudging one toward peril. Across the Imperium, from the sun-scorched forges of Mars to the frostbitten spires of Fenris, this tension repeats, echoing in countless chapels and shrines. Devotion is lauded, yet the path to excess lies ever near. A lingering gaze upon a statue, a whispered petition repeated one too many times, a fascination with hidden scripture may invite suspicion and the gaze of the Ecclesiarchy. It is this subtle balance that defines life within the im-pe-e-um, the coexistence of sanctity and danger, of awe and the shadow of obsession. Even the humblest citizen, kneeling in quiet reverence, risks stepping beyond the invisible boundaries drawn by ritual and doctrine. And yet, for many, the temptation is irresistible, the desire to understand, to feel closer than obedience allows, to seek truths forbidden yet tantalizing. In these candlelit halls, where shadow and reverence intertwine, one glimpses the fragile boundary between devotion and fanaticism. Here, in whispered prayers and flickering light, the first threads of potential heresy take shape, subtle and almost imperceptible. The faithful are drawn along a path defined not only by duty, but by the seductive pull of excess, where piety can harden into compulsion, and awe into dangerous knowledge. As the drums fade to a low resonant murmur and the incense smoke curls toward vaulted ceilings, the scene leaves more than silence, it leaves a question. How far can reverence stretch before it snaps? When does faith become obsession? And in that liminal space, where do the loyal truly stand? It is from this threshold, poised between obedience and excess, that we step into the heart of devotion itself, its power, its dangers, and the subtle temptations that may transform loyalty into heresy. The nature of devotion in the Imperium is not easily defined. Across countless star systems, it manifests in forms as varied as the planets themselves. On a temperate agri-world, a humble farmer may rise before dawn to chant the litany of guidance, offering the first fruits of his harvest to the Emperor. Each movement is deliberate, each word measured, a ritual performed with steady hands and unwavering faith. Here, devotion is quiet, restrained, and sanctified by centuries of tradition. Yet on a forge world where the air is thick with soot and the din of industry never ceases, devotion takes a different shape. A tech priest or factory overseer may inscribe prayers into molten metal or engrave the Emperor's name into the gears and pistons of production lines. The fervor is practical but no less consuming. The boundaries between duty and worship blur as the faithful pour not only their effort, but their souls into each act. It is within these variations that the first distinction arises. Devotion is measured by purpose, while fanaticism is marked by excess. The line is subtle, often imperceptible to all but the most discerning observers. A citizen may bow repeatedly to a statue of the Emperor, whispering the same prayer dozens of times each day. If this repetition is meant to reinforce faith and order, it is devotion. If it becomes a compulsion that isolates, consumes, or distorts judgment, it enters the territory of fanaticism. Even among the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines, this line exists. A brother may meditate for hours before a reliquary, seeking to understand the Emperor's will and prepare for battle. Another may become obsessed with visions, interpreting every sign as a personal message, a portent, or a command. Both are devoted, but only one risks falling into an imbalance that could lead to questioning doctrine or embracing unsanctioned acts. Across the Imperium, the variations are endless. On the ice world of Fenris, devotees might march through blizzards to honor the emperor, chants echoing like frozen thunder across snowbound peaks. On the desert world of Baradur Prime, pilgrims trudge under scorching suns, carrying icons and relics, performing rites that are as much endurance tests as acts of worship. The rituals differ, but the underlying impulse is the same: a desire to connect with the emperor, to express loyalty, and to define one's place within the vast, unforgiving structure of the Im-Pir-E-. Yet even in these disciplined acts, subtle signs of excess can appear. A priest who lingers too long over a scripture, a devotee who repeats a prayer until lips bleed, or a citizen who isolates themselves entirely for contemplation. All of these hint at devotion, teetering on the edge of fanaticism. Observers within the Ecclesiarchy note such behaviors, aware that unchecked fervor may sow seeds of heresy. The crucial difference between devotion and fanaticism is not always visible. It resides in intention, in moderation, and in the ability to remain tethered to the collective belief sanctioned by the Im-Pir-E-. Where devotion strengthens community, reinforces duty, and uplifts spirit, fanaticism isolates, distorts, and threatens order. Understanding this line, and recognizing the warning signs, is essential not only for survival but for the preservation of the emperor's domain. As the candles flicker in countless chapels across the stars, the faithful continue their rituals, unaware of the delicate balance they maintain. Each chant, each bow, each offering carries weight, and each has the potential to shift from acceptable devotion to dangerous fanaticism. And in that potential lies the first step on a path that some will tread unknowingly, toward outcomes that the Imperium's enforcers would call heresy. It is on this delicate edge, where devotion flirts with obsession, that the true nature of faith begins to reveal itself, its power, its danger, and the subtle forces that guide or mislead the loyal. On a quiet alcove of a distant hive, a servo skull hovers silently, observing every motion of a young acolyte. His hands tremble as he clasps the emperor's sacred symbol, eyes flicking repeatedly to the gilded statue dominating the chamber. Each movement is meticulously recorded by the mechanical witness, a reminder that, in the Imperium, even devotion is never truly private. The acolyte murmurs prayers with a fervor bordering on compulsion, repeating phrases too rapidly for the human tongue, yet perfectly measured for the years of the servo skull. Here, the fine line between devotion and fanaticism becomes most apparent. The acolyte's intentions remain sincere, yet the intensity of his actions raises questions. Is this a model of perfect obedience or the first tremor of obsession? On worlds such as Kalth or Ulana, similar behaviors have been noted, sometimes resulting in great honor and other times triggering investigations by the Ecclesiarchy. Context matters. Even across the vast Imperium, careful discernment is required to distinguish motive from excess. Even the greatest heroes are not immune. Consider a space marine of the Ultramarines chapter, meditating before a reliquary. Hours pass in a mingling scent of incense and metal armor, as he seeks guidance from the emperor. A brother watches silently, noting shifts in posture, intensity in the eyes, and whispers perceptible only to those attuned to the warp. What defines devotion, and when does it tip into self-styled sanctity that might challenge doctrine? These questions linger, unspoken yet weighty, across the Im-Pir-E-. Expressions of devotion take many forms. On worlds scarred by endless war, citizens may write letters to the emperor, praying for their loved ones' survival amid the grinding engines of battle. On hive worlds, steeped in industry and corruption, the faithful may perform grueling penances, walk barefoot through molten slag, or inscribe sacred prayers into steel. Each act blends love, fear, and reverence, a living tapestry of devotion. Yet even in such extremes, the shadow of excess looms over every gesture. The subtle danger of fanaticism lies in its incremental nature. No one begins with heresy, it creeps forward step by step. A citizen spends more hours in prayer than in labor. A tech priest becomes absorbed in forbidden texts. A space marine interprets omens invisible to his brothers. Each act is justified as devotion, yet the cumulative effect can distort perception, challenge doctrine, and draw the attention of those tasked with maintaining the emperor's order. Through observation, tradition, and ritual, the Imperium strives to maintain balance. The Ecclesiarchy codifies behavior, prescribes liturgies, and investigates anomalies. Yet the line between fervor and fanaticism remains deeply personal and fluid. History across millennia demonstrates that unchecked devotion, guided by desire rather than duty, can become the seed of heresy. When the acolyte finally lowers his hands, breath ragged after hours of unbroken prayer, the servo skull records every detail, Candlelight flickers across the chamber's metal, casting shadows that dance like specters on stone walls. In these small, seemingly insignificant moments, the nature of devotion is revealed not as simple obedience, but as a complex force capable of inspiring greatness or inviting peril. And so, from these quiet corners, where reverence flirts with obsession, our gaze turns to the Ecclesiarchy itself, watching, guiding, and sometimes correcting those whose devotion threatens to slip beyond control. The Ecclesiarchy is more than an institution. It is the living embodiment of doctrine, the spine of faith that channels devotion across the Im-Pir-E-. Its influence stretches from the lowest high valley to the highest planetary spire, touching every prayer, gesture, and liturgical act. Within its halls, doctrine is not merely written, it is a living code, a framework that defines what devotion should be, how it should manifest, and where it risks slipping into forbidden obsession. In the dimly lit cathedral on Hive Tarsus, the scent of burning incense is sharp, heavy with resin and spice. The rhythmic cadence of ceremonial drums resonates through stone arches, echoing in the marrow of the faithful who kneel before a gilded statue of the emperor. Here doctrine is not abstract, it is tangible in every chant, every bow, every flicker of candlelight. Each action is prescribed by meticulous rules, drawn from the Codex Ecclesiasticus and the countless tomes preserved across centuries. The rules of devotion are precise: bow too low, linger too long in prayer, or speak unsanctioned interpretations. And the action may shift from acceptable devotion to a breach of doctrine. Even the smallest gestures are catalogued: the number of steps taken before the altar, the sequence of rosary beads, the exact phrasing of litanies. Doctrine ensures uniformity, guiding the faithful while curbing impulses that might spiral into fanaticism. Yet the line is subtle. On the world of Calth, a minor acolyte once prolonged prayers far beyond the prescribed hour, convinced that extended recitation would grant him the emperor's favor. His devotion, though sincere, unsettled his peers and drew the attention of the local priests. Doctrine demanded correction. A penance ritual was performed, a public admonishment that reminded all observers that even the purest intent must remain aligned with sanctioned practice. Doctrine also distinguishes devotion from fanaticism. Devotion uplifts, guides, and strengthens loyalty, reinforcing the communal bonds of the faithful. Fanaticism isolates, consumes, and distorts judgment. On the desert world of Barad-dûr Prime, a priest named Althor began interpreting the Codex Ecclesiasticus with personal embellishments, claiming divine insight. Initially, his congregation grew, inspired by his intensity, but his teachings gradually deviated from accepted doctrine, emphasizing visions and mystical experiences over structured worship. The Ecclesiarchy intervened. Althor was stripped of rank and confined, his writings burned. The punishment, harsh but necessary, reinforced the principle that doctrine is the measure of devotion, not the enthusiasm of the individual. Even the most disciplined space marines are not exempt. Chaplains instruct, correct, and evaluate their brethren according to doctrine, ensuring that martial zeal does not become self-styled divinity or unsanctioned mysticism. A brother may meditate for hours before a reliquary, but if he begins to interpret omens as personal commands from the emperor, the line has been crossed. Doctrine acts as a safeguard, preserving loyalty and order across both civilian and martial populations. Doctrines extend to architecture, ritual, and the sensory experience of worship. Altars are placed to guide movement. Candles and incense focus attention and evoke awe. Chants are timed to synchronize with ritual rhythms. Every element is calculated to enforce the correct expression of devotion, to channel fervor safely, and to prevent excess. Even the smallest deviation can be spotted by the vigilant eyes of priests, inquisitors, and service schools, ensuring that faith is structured, observable, and aligned with orthodoxy. It is here, in the intersection of doctrine and human devotion, that the delicate balance of faith is maintained. Doctrine does not merely restrict it, defines, instructs, and elevates, shaping the actions of the faithful while guarding against the subtle drift toward obsession or heresy. From these corridors of controlled ritual and precise codification, the faithful step into the wider Imperium, carrying with them the lessons of doctrine, and as devotion is measured, corrected, and guided, the stage is set to observe the consequences when faith is pushed beyond the boundaries the Ecclesiarchy has carefully constructed. Beyond the structured halls of temples, the Ecclesiarchy exercises its authority through the enforcement of doctrine, ensuring that deviation is swiftly identified and addressed. Each world, from the icy wastes of Fenris to the molten forges of Ryza, maintains registers of clerical activity, ritual compliance, and reported anomalies. observers both mortal and mechanical note the faithful whose actions edge toward fanaticism, cataloging behavior to discern intent, sincerity, and potential danger. One infamous example occurred on the hive world of Desolation. A priest named Valrin, convinced of a personal connection to the emperor, began delivering sermons that encouraged private visions as the ultimate test of faith. Initially tolerated, his teachings gained followers rapidly. Doctrine, however, is absolute. The Codex Ecclesiasticus prohibits individual interpretation that contradicts sanctioned scripture. The Ecclesiarchy intervened, first issuing warnings and assigning public penances. When Valrin persisted, he was publicly stripped of his vestments and sentenced to a ritual of atonement in the catacombs of purity, a grim confinement designed to realign his mind with the approved faith. The psychological impact of such corrective measures is profound. Witnesses describe the tension in the air during ritual adjudication, the low hum of chant, the acrid scent of incense, the flickering shadows of candlelight across stone walls. The faithful feel the weight of doctrine pressing upon them, a constant reminder that devotion, while sacred, must never escape the boundaries set by the Ecclesiarchy. Some internalize the lesson, returning to measured worship. Others, however, carry seeds of resentment, curiosity, or doubt, illustrating the fragile nature of control over human devotion. Doctrine also defines proper forms of worship and the acceptable intensity of practice. On industrial hive worlds, acolytes must follow liturgical sequences to the letter, the number of steps, the angle of bows, the timing of prayers. Even minor error-skipped phrases, misaligned gestures can draw attention. These rules, while strict, serve to protect the faithful, ensuring that devotion remains communal, disciplined, and aligned with the emperor's sanctioned guidance rather than personal obsession. Importantly, doctrine does not exist in isolation from the warp's influence. The Ecclesiarchy recognizes that uncontrolled zeal may open gateways to chaos. A novice who pursues visions beyond sanctioned limits, or a cleric who experiments with forbidden rites, risks corrupting not only their mind but the moral fabric of their community. Doctrine functions as both shield and guide. It preserves orthodoxy, directs ritual, and guards against the subtle seduction of the warp. Even within the most disciplined orders, doctrine is tested. Chaplains instruct space marines, correcting overzealous interpretations, monitoring dreams and visions, and ensuring that martial devotion remains within sanctioned bounds. Civilian acolytes are similarly observed, often under the unblinking eyes of sculls, noting repetitions, intonation, and alignment with scripture. Each corrective act, each ritualized penance, reinforces the boundaries doctrine imposes and the consequences of stepping beyond them. Through centuries of meticulous record-keeping and enforcement, the Ecclesiarchy maintains the delicate balance of devotion across the It is a system of guidance, correction, and, when necessary, punishment, all designed to ensure that loyalty remains true while safeguarding against the slow creep of obsession. Yet even under this watchful guidance, the human heart can wander, and devotion that seems faithful may begin to teeter toward obsession and, eventually, heresy. From these quiet halls and measured rituals, we follow the path of the faithful as personal fervor, unchecked curiosity, and the lure of forbidden knowledge slowly twist loyalty into rebellion. The path from loyal devotion to heresy is rarely abrupt. It begins quietly, often unnoticed in the hidden corners of the where the fervor of a solitary mind exceeds the boundaries of sanctioned rituals. A priest lingering too long over forbidden texts, a novice interpreting visions as personal commands, or a space marine contemplating omens all are subtle beginnings. The initial spark may appear innocent, driven by a zeal to serve the emperor more perfectly, yet it conceals the seeds of rebellion. During the Horus Heresy, such sparks multiplied into a wild blaze. A commander of the Lunar Wolves, chosen for his devotion, began interpreting the emperor's will through personal revelation. What was once disciplined loyalty warped into self-affirming prophecy. The line between following divine guidance and imposing personal vision blurred dangerously. Those who followed him, drawn by the intensity of his belief, acted on assumptions rather than scripture. What began as extreme devotion evolved into a calculated rebellion. Psychology played a crucial role in this decay. The human mind craves purpose and clarity. In a galaxy of endless war and oppression, devotion provides structure. However, when the mind perceives itself as uniquely chosen or specially enlightened, that devotion can transform. A loyal servant begins prioritizing personal understanding over communal guidance. Rituals once meant to reinforce unity now become evidence of superiority. Every whispered interpretation, every private act of devotion beyond sanctioned practice, reinforces an illusion of individual significance. Subtle actions accumulate: the cleric who lingers too long in contemplation, the one who prays in secret during forbidden hours, or the one experimenting with psychic abilities or walk a dangerous line. Each deviation is a psychological rehearsal, a step toward self-justified rebellion. The warp whispers in these moments, not always audible, yet keenly felt by those teetering on obsession. Colors in incense smoke may appear brighter, chants may echo differently, shadows may feel alive. The boundary between devotion and delusion grows thin. Historical examples bear this out. In the industrial sprawl of Calth, a minor cleric began performing personal rites, claiming visions of the emperor. Initially tolerated, his congregation gradually expanded, encouraged by the perceived insight he possessed. The Ecclesiarchy intervened with correction and penance, but the cleric's obsession intensified. He began recruiting disciples who shared his zeal, and soon clandestine rituals were conducted under the cover of darkness. This microcosm mirrored the macrocosm of Horus himself, intense personal devotion gradually leading to heretical acts. Driven by allure, perceived favor, and the subtle influence of the warp, decay seldom proceeds in a straight line. Loyal souls oscillate between compliance and innovation, between fidelity and doubt. At times, self-discipline restrains them. At others, minor successes in private devotion reinforce a sense of special enlightenment. It is within these oscillations that heresy takes root. Individuals convince themselves they serve the emperor best by acting beyond approved boundaries, interpreting signs, bending rules, and testing limits. Every act is internally justified as a higher form of devotion, even when it violates doctrine. Cinematic glimpses of this transformation are vivid. Imagine a lone figure kneeling before a flickering statue of the emperor. Candlelight dances across tense features. Hands tremble not from fear, but anticipation. The incense is thick, acrid, almost electric. Forbidden prayers are whispered as half-closed, listening to faint echoes of a voice, perhaps the warp, perhaps the mind playing tricks. Nearby, a hovering servo-skull silently records the moment, oblivious to the subtle corruption unfolding. The act appears devout, yet signals a step toward heresy, a shift from disciplined faith to personal obsession. Through these stages, the transformation is nearly invisible to outsiders. Only the constant vigilance of the Ecclesiarchy, the keen observation of fellow disciples, or the catastrophic consequences of misjudged zeal reveal the true danger. The loyal servant grows increasingly autonomous, interpreting the emperor's will in isolation, until the boundary between devotion and rebellion is irreversibly crossed. Even the mightiest heroes of the Imperium are not immune. Space Marines trained in discipline and obedience are seduced by visions of grandeur, manipulated by personal allure, or overwhelmed by individual zeal, demonstrating that the path from loyalty to heresy respects neither rank nor honor, only the fragile limits of the human heart. The influence of the warp is subtle but persistent, especially upon those already teetering on the edge of devotion. A mind inclined toward extremity is further swayed by its whispers, finding meaning where none exists, sensing omens in shadows, hearing commands in echoes. Psychers drawn to forbidden knowledge have their talents magnify both devotion and danger. A simple meditation can transform into a ritual that summons forces beyond comprehension, each success reinforcing the illusion of divine favor. On the forge world of Riza, a young cleric with latent psychic potential began experimenting with flowing light, a meditation practice once considered safe. Initial results appeared miraculous: visions of the emperor's will, subtle guidance on governance, and personal insight that astonished even senior clergy. Yet with each session, the warp's tendrils crept deeper into his consciousness. Perception shifted. Shadows moved unnaturally. Voices echoed between walls. Incense smoke carried hidden messages. What began as devotion became obsession, a dangerous interplay between faith and warp-induced distortion. Case studies across the Imperium mirror this pattern. On the hive world of Baradua Prime, a once disciplined and loyal sect began clandestine nighttime rites. Their initial goal was understanding the emperor's will. Over months, rituals darkened, incorporating private supplications and symbolic offerings not sanctioned by doctrine. Observers noted subtle signs, an eerie synchronization of gestures, whispered voices in empty corridors, the unnerving composure of participants even as chaos simmered beneath the surface. Warp's influence was evident, bending perception and reinforcing belief in exceptional devotion. The Horus Heresy exemplifies this most clearly. Loyal sons of the Emperor, Space Marines trained in discipline and obedience, were seduced by visions of glory and whispered fate. Every step from questioning orders to secret councils, from interpreting omens privately to overt defiance, occurred incrementally. The transition from loyalty to outright rebellion was almost imperceptible to contemporaries, yet its consequences were catastrophic. The line between obedience and challenge blurred, showing that even the most disciplined warriors are vulnerable when personal zeal outweighs doctrine and oversight. Psychological analysis reveals the mechanism behind this shift. Admiration, isolation, and perceived special status reinforced the belief that conventional doctrine is insufficient. Devotion, once communal, becomes intensely personal, and each successful clandestine act justifies further deviation. Warped manipulations, subtle cognitive distortions, and even peer responses amplify this feedback loop. Individuals believe they act in the Emperor's service, yet each act moves them further from sanctioned faith. Cinematic glimpses illustrate the terror and majesty of this transformation. Picture a hooded acolyte kneeling in a darkened chapel. Incense swirls, carrying both sanctity and a faint electric tingle of warp. Hands hover over ritual implements, trembling with anticipation. Voices half-heard, half-imagined echo from stone walls, guiding, coaxing, promising insight. Candle flames flicker, shadows dance unnaturally, and the chamber seems alive, watching. To an outsider, this appears devout. To the warp, it is a gateway. Every whispered petition, every secret gesture, is a step toward heresy, an almost imperceptible drift from loyal service to dangerous obsession. Even the most seasoned clergy or inquisitors may fail to detect these early stages. The shift from devotion to heresy unfolds gradually, nearly invisible in daily practice. Only when acts extend into wider society, rituals publicized, doctrines disseminated, or uncontrolled psychic phenomena, the danger become undeniable. By then the individual is often fully immersed in their own perception of righteousness, impervious to correction from outside. Thus, this transformation is a study in tension. Faith, intended to bind and guide, becomes a force of isolation, obsession, and ultimately, rebellion. Historians, inquisitors, and even companions recognize the pattern. Unchecked personal zeal, amplified by curiosity and warp influence, is the crucible in which heresy is forged. From these shadows, the chronicles of the Imperium emerge, a story of those who fell, of failed mechanisms, and the tragic beauty of devotion misplaced. Across the vast expanse of the Imperium, countless stories record the delicate and sometimes tragic interplay between devotion and heresy. Each world, each hive, carries its own record of individuals whose faith, once pure, became a source of danger. These case studies illuminate not only the human tendency toward obsession, but also the rigid framework of doctrine that both guides and confines the faithful. On the hive world of Calth, a minor acolyte named Seren displayed exceptional zeal from a young age. His devotion was exemplary, every prayer meticulously timed, every ritual observed with precision, yet his intensity drew attention, not always favorably. Over months, Seren began supplementing sanctioned prayers with private incantations, convinced that the Emperor sought guidance from him alone. The subtle whispers of the warp, imperceptible to others, seemed to respond to his devotions, reinforcing his sense of unique purpose. The Ecclesiarchy intervened first with observation, then with guidance. Seren was assigned additional duties, chanted litanies in public, and underwent ritual purification. Yet his private practices persisted. It was only when fellow acolytes reported unusual activity, midnight prayers with forbidden implements, that the tribunal acted decisively. Seren was brought before a council of priests, stripped of his ceremonial robes, and confined in the monastery's inner sanctum for meditation and atonement. The incident became a cautionary tale, illustrating the line between extreme devotion and heresy, and the necessity of vigilance. On the Forge world of Ryza, the case of Brother Kellen, a veteran Space Marine chaplain, demonstrated how even the most disciplined warriors could be seduced by personal fervor during a campaign against Xeno's incursions. Kellen began interpreting battlefield omens as personal messages from the Emperor. Initially minor, adjusting strategy based on visions, these actions escalated. Fellow officers observed deviations from doctrine, unauthorized rituals before combat, secret prayers invoking forbidden elements of the warp, and insistence on following personal guidance over sanctioned command. Kellen's obsession culminated in an unsanctioned psychic ritual, attempting to harness energy from the warp to strengthen his squad. The attempt failed, leaving psychic scars and physical devastation. The Ecclesiarchy intervened, confining Kellen to the chaplaincy's meditation crypts, where he remained under supervision for decades. His story served as both warning and lesson. Even the strongest training could not wholly prevent the human mind from drifting when devotion outpaced oversight. Not all cases are so extreme, yet all reveal the fragile boundary between faith and obsession. On Barad-dûr Prime, a small congregation of priests, inspired by visions of divine favor, began subtle deviations in ritual timing and phrasing. Each change, minor in isolation, accumulated into practices that diverged from doctrine, while initially tolerated. These deviations eventually attracted attention when members reported miraculous occurrences, phenomena likely caused by psychic resonance rather than divine intervention. The Ecclesiarchy intervened with public admonishment, reassignment of duties, and ritual penance, restoring orthodoxy while preventing escalation into heresy. Even the most benign actions can become dangerous when amplified by personal interpretation and warp influence. An acolyte might rearrange candles for better focus, adjust chants for greater clarity, or whisper prayers at unsanctioned hours, believing in a special connection to the emperor. These seemingly innocuous choices, repeated over weeks or months, shape perception, reinforce the illusion of singular favor, and gradually desensitize the individual to the boundaries set by doctrine. Picture a dimly lit chapel, incense curling in golden tendrils around flickering candles. A lone acolyte kneels, eyes half closed, hands hovering over ritual implements. Every motion is deliberate, yet tinged with anxiety and anticipation. The faint hum of a servo skull records each gesture, while shadows flicker unnaturally against stone walls, hinting at the warp's subtle presence. The act appears devotional, yet under doctrine it signals a step toward heresy. Outside observers may see only reverence. Insiders perceive the beginning of a dangerous drift. Across these diverse worlds, a pattern emerges. Devotion, when untempered by doctrine and oversight, can transform even the purest intent into dangerous obsession. The Ecclesiarchy's interventions, ritual correction, public penance, and confinement demonstrate the necessity of vigilance. Each case reinforces the dual lesson. Devotion is sacred, but unchecked, it is fragile and perilous. From these individual narratives, the systemic consequences become clear. Patterns of obsession, subtle heresy, and warp influence converge across the Imperium, showing how even the most disciplined faith can be twisted when devotion exceeds guidance. The warp itself, with its hidden currents and forbidden knowledge, draws the eager and the zealous alike, entwining psychic influence and chaos with devotion gone astray. The consequences of unchecked devotion often manifest in ways both subtle and catastrophic. On the hive world of Desolatia, a priest named Valrin began privately interpreting sacred texts, claiming visions of the emperor's will that contradicted sanctioned teachings. At first, his congregation found inspiration in his fervor. Whispers of insight spread quietly through corridors of the temple. Observers noted unusual behaviors, extended periods of solitary meditation, ritual gestures performed in unapproved sequences, and insistence that his personal interpretations carried greater weight than traditional doctrine. Initially, the Ecclesiarchy intervened with counsel and minor penances. Valrin was ordered to recite litanies publicly, adhere to prescribed sequences, and submit his insights for review. For a time, he complied, but the drive for personal recognition persisted. Gradually, the acts grew bolder. Clandestine night prayers, subtle alterations of liturgy, and recruitment of followers to perform unsanctioned rites. The warp, barely perceptible to others, seemed to respond to these acts, infusing the environment with an almost tangible tension. The tribunal eventually took harsher measures. Valrin was stripped of vestments, publicly admonished, and confined within the inner sanctum for extended meditation. The sensory experience of the ritual was designed to impress both severity and divine oversight. Incense thick in the air, flickering candles casting uncertain shadows, echoes of chanting reverberating across stone. The acolyte, surrounded by the solemn gaze of fellow priests, experienced both isolation and the heavy weight of doctrine. These corrective actions often stabilized those whose devotion had veered too far. Yet for some, resentment and obsession remained, laying the groundwork for further deviation. Another case occurred on Barad-dûr Prime, where a group of acolytes, initially disciplined, began subtle experiments with psychic abilities. Intent on perceiving the emperor's will directly, they held secret meditations, manipulating small fragments of the warp in ways not sanctioned by doctrine. At first, minor successes, visions, fleeting impressions, inexplicable coincidences reinforced their belief in divine favor. The acolytes' perceptions shifted. Shadows appeared to move with intent. Chants resonated differently, and the room seemed alive. Though the acts appeared devotional, they were increasingly influenced by the warp. slowly transforming the faithful into potential agents of heresy. Even high-ranking space marines are not immune. A chaplain of the Salamanders, observing battlefield omens, began interpreting patterns as personal messages from the Emperor. Minor at first, choosing formations or tactics based on vision, these decisions escalated. Unsanctioned rituals preceded combat, private invocations called upon forbidden elements of the warp, and guidance was given according to personal revelation rather than doctrine. When results became dangerously unpredictable, senior officers intervened, confining the chaplain to meditation crypts and reviewing his psychic abilities. His story, repeated across the Imperium, illustrates a recurring theme. Extreme devotion amplified by personal insight and psychic perception can precipitate acts that verge on heresy. The pattern across these diverse examples is clear. Deviations often begin small: prolonged prayer, private rituals, personal interpretations of doctrine, or experimentation with latent psychic abilities. The combination of human ambition, perceived favor, and subtle warp influence amplifies these actions, reinforcing the illusion that the individual is uniquely chosen. Surveillance by the Ecclesiarchy, strict adherence to ritual, and corrective penance aim to prevent escalation. Yet the temptation of forbidden knowledge and the seduction of personal significance persist. Cinematic moments illustrate the danger. Imagine a candlelit cathedral where an acolyte kneels alone. The incense curls thick in the air, the shadows sway unnaturally, and a faint hum vibrates from unseen sources. The individual whispers forbidden prayers, hands hovering over ritual implements. The act is devotional in appearance, yet the warp subtly weaves through perception, making every movement seem imbued with divine purpose. Observers may see only reverence, unaware that obsession is quietly taking root. Across these case studies, a pattern emerges. Devotion, when unchecked by doctrine or oversight, risks evolving into heresy. Each tale is a reminder that faith alone, no matter how sincere, can be a fragile shield against the subtle pull of obsession, personal interpretation, and the warp's hidden currents. The stories set the stage for the next reality the faithful face: their confrontation with the warp itself and the forbidden knowledge that tempts even the most disciplined. The warp is never silent. Even the most disciplined minds cannot ignore its whispers, tugging at devotion with promises of insight beyond mortal grasp. A solitary acolyte kneeling in a dim chamber may notice subtle shifts in the air, faint echoes of guidance, or presences invisible to others. These perceptions are deceptive, tinged with both allure and danger, convincing the faithful that their devotion has unlocked secret favor from the Emperor. On the forge world of Ryza, a young cleric explored meditation techniques bordering on psychic influence. At first, visions were simple clarity, guidance, reassurance, but over time, the environment itself seemed charged. Shadows stretched unnaturally, incense swirled in deliberate patterns, and faint hums vibrated through stone walls. Each small success reinforced the acolyte's belief in his unique purpose, placing him above the limits of doctrine. What began as pure devotion subtly intertwined with obsession, perception bending to personal interpretation. Forbidden knowledge is particularly treacherous, for it tempts both curiosity and zeal. Hidden texts, restricted rituals, and suppressed psychic techniques offer insights at the cost of safety and orthodoxy. A faithful servant might justify whispered invocations, altered litanies, or secret psychic experiments as necessary for understanding the Emperor's will. Each deviation, however minor, reinforces exceptionalism and erodes the barriers erected by doctrine and oversight. Even the most disciplined space marines are not immune. Librarians and chaplains, exposed to omens and psychic phenomena, may interpret visions as private mandates. One psycholibrarian, convinced of a personal revelation, performed unsanctioned invocations to harness warp energy during a campaign. The attempt left psychic scars and threatened the lives of his squad. Among the most disciplined, the intersection of personal zeal and psychic influence can distort devotion into dangerous obsession. Cinematic imagery brings the danger to life. Imagine a candlelit cathedral, incense curling thick in the air, shadows stretching unnaturally. A lone acolyte kneels, hands hovering over ritual implements. Eyes glint with reflected candlelight, face tense with concentration. Whispers real or imagined echo from the walls, guiding gestures, bending perception. Every act appears devotional, yet is subtly entwined with the currents of the Imperium. One misstep, one whispered deviation, and devotion teeters on the edge of heresy. History provides chilling precedents. During the Great Crusade, minor deviations, an acolyte experimenting with psychic meditation, a priest interpreting visions privately, or a small sect performing altered rituals often escalated. Warp influence amplified each act, strengthening belief in individual significance. By the time intervention occurred, obsession was entrenched, sometimes culminating in open heresy. The human mind, isolated and exposed to psychic stimuli, is particularly vulnerable. A solitary act of devotion can transform perception. Shadows may move. Sounds may carry hidden meaning. Rituals may feel alive with unseen energy. The Imperium exploits these perceptions, whispering promises of insight, amplifying the subtle thrill of forbidden knowledge. The faithful may remain convinced that every irregular action serves the Emperor's will. Even careful guidance cannot fully counteract this. Doctrine, oversight, and ritual correction establish boundaries, yet the currents of the warp find cracks in perception and resolve. Faith, intense and curious, becomes a conduit through which forbidden knowledge seeps. The line between devotion and danger blurs. Consequences, though gradual, are profound. Minds reshaped, perception altered, obedience undermined. In cathedrals, meditation chambers, and isolated hives, devotion and chaos intertwine. Shadowed figures whisper prayers infused with ambition. Hands trace unapproved patterns. Subtle currents swirl around. What appears as loyalty may conceal the first tremors of obsession, the initial steps toward heresy, and the irresistible lure of forbidden knowledge the Imperium forbids. Across the industrial hive of Barad-dûr Prime, a small group of priests began experimenting with psychic techniques. Initially sanctioned meditations soon crossed invisible boundaries. They reported visions of guidance, subtle manipulations of the warp that felt like blessings, and interpretations of events that placed them above ordinary clergy. As sessions grew more frequent, perception altered. Familiar cathedral corridors seemed alive. Candles flickered in unnatural patterns, and incense smoke twisted as if conveying hidden meaning. The warp had seeped into their consciousness, amplifying devotion and shaping it toward obsession. The seduction of forbidden knowledge is not purely mystical. Even texts labeled heretical, rituals forbidden by the Ecclesiarchy, and arcane psychic techniques provide a tangible draw. Each successful experiment, each private revelation, each minor breach of doctrine reinforces a sense of externalism. The devout begin to justify deviations, claiming the Emperor's favor for acts explicitly forbidden. The line between obedience and rebellion blurs, and every act of unmonitored devotion becomes a small step toward heresy. Even among the elite, the warp's influence persists. Chaplains and psychers trained for discipline and mental fortitude are not immune. One librarian, seeking insight during a campaign, used forbidden psychic channels to interpret battlefield omens. Initially, minor deviations slightly altered formations or tactical choices escalated. Rituals performed before combat began invoking elements explicitly forbidden by doctrine. The warp amplified his perceptions. Shadows moved unnaturally. Whispers guided his hands, and visions confirmed personal interpretations. Senior officers intervened, yet the episode demonstrated that discipline alone cannot shield even the most loyal from obsession when the warp intervenes. Cinematic glimpses underscore the danger. Picture a candlelit chamber, incense thick in the air. A lone acolyte kneels, eyes half closed, fingers tracing symbols in the air. Shadows twist unnaturally, humming faintly, and whispers real or imagined coax gestures and thoughts. Each action seems devotional, yet the warp's subtle currents manipulate perception, creating an intoxicating illusion of insight. The human mind, isolated and intensely focused, is vulnerable. Even acts that appear reverent carry the first tremors of heresy. The consequences of yielding to such influence are severe. Minds may twist, perception bends, and devotion turns inward, serving personal obsession rather than communal guidance. Minor errors escalate to significant deviations, and the individual's interpretation becomes immutable, defended as sacred. Entire congregations or squads can be drawn along this path, following charismatic figures who believe themselves uniquely favored. The Imperium, despite centuries of oversight and doctrine, sees repetition of this cycle: intense devotion, subtle warp influence, minor deviation, obsession, heresy. This dynamic highlights the duality of faith. Devotion is necessary for cohesion and purpose, yet it is fragile. The warp exploits that fragility, magnifying ambition, curiosity, and desire for exceptional insight. Even the most disciplined are susceptible to subtle distortion, and each transgression, however minor, reshapes perception. What was once disciplined, measured worship can become private obsession, followed by dangerous acts justified in the name of the Emperor. In these moments, the faithful are both illuminated and endangered. Perception becomes fluid, reality shifts subtly, and forbidden knowledge tempts with the promise of understanding beyond mortal limits. Devotion and chaos entwine, forming a nexus where loyalty can slip into rebellion. From these shadowed corners, the Imperium witnesses the peril inherent in zeal untempered, and the need for vigilance remains paramount. Devotion within the Imperium is a force both unifying and dangerous. On one hand, it binds countless worlds, guiding billions with unwavering loyalty to the Emperor. On the other, taken to extremes, it becomes a crucible, where the very principles it serves can be distorted or destroyed. The philosophical tension lies not in faith itself, but in its application. How much devotion is virtuous, and when does it become morally perilous? Across history, faithful servants have wrestled with this balance. Clerics and priests, sworn to uphold the Emperor's will, must navigate the narrow corridor between measured devotion and personal interpretation. Their actions, seemingly righteous, are constantly evaluated against doctrine. Even the most disciplined find themselves tempted to act upon personal insight, interpreting omens uniquely, extending ritual privately, or seeking knowledge deemed forbidden. These actions raise profound questions. Is it moral to pursue understanding beyond sanctioned limits? Can zeal, intended to honor the Emperor, justify deviation from doctrine? The answers are neither simple nor universal. Extreme devotion, when unchecked, mirrors patterns found in historical religions beyond the 40K universe. Saints, mystics, or zealots throughout human history often engaged in practices that, while personally sincere, conflicted with established dogma. Their intentions were devotion, yet the consequences ranged from social upheaval to outright persecution. In the Im-Pir-E-, the stakes are magnified. Deviation can catalyze heresy, endanger lives, and destabilize entire worlds. The moral calculus becomes even more complex with the presence of the warp, the seductive influence of psychic power and forbidden knowledge blurs the line between right and wrong. An acolyte convinced of personal favor may believe every action serves the Emperor, yet the warp bends perception, rendering the devout blind to the moral consequences of their deeds. The ethical dilemma intensifies. Is intent enough to justify action? Or does true morality demand adherence to doctrine above personal conviction? Authority within the Im-Pir-E-M adds another layer of complexity. The Ecclesiarchy and other religious overseers wield immense power, defining acceptable devotion and heresy. Their interventions, often severe, may save the faithful from themselves but can also stifle personal insight or provoke resentment. Obedience is morally lauded, yet the human mind capable of curiosity and independent thought sometimes rebels, not out of malice, but from a sincere desire to serve more perfectly. The tension between hierarchical authority and personal conviction creates a persistent ethical ambiguity. Light dances through the stained glass, illuminating the inner conflict of a priest kneeling before the Emperor. Picture a grand cathedral atop a hive spire, sunlight slicing through stained glass. A priest kneels before the Emperor's image, hands raised, eyes closed. Their heart pounds with devotion, mind teetering on revelation. Shadows shift unnaturally as the warp whispers faintly at the edges of perception. Every gesture, every whispered prayer, embodies both loyalty and danger. The scene is majestic yet precarious, a visual metaphor for the moral tightrope the faithful must walk. Even heroes of the Imperium are not immune. Space Marines, trained for discipline and obedience, confront ethical dilemmas when visions, psychic impressions, or battlefield omens suggest deviations from command. Acting on these impulses may enhance effectiveness or safeguard lives, yet it risks straying from sanctioned doctrine. The ethical question persists. When does necessary judgment become personal arrogance, and when does devotion justify rebellion? Historical precedents reinforce the stakes. During the Horus Heresy, countless loyalists acted with conviction, convinced of the Emperor's favor. Yet misinterpretation, obsession, and warp influence led many astray. Their intentions were pure, but the consequences catastrophic. The philosophical lesson endures. Intent alone is insufficient. Devotion must be balanced with oversight, self-awareness, and humility, lest the moral compass bend dangerously. Extreme devotion, when untethered from oversight or tempered judgment, reveals the fragility inherent in faith. Within the Im-Pir-E, countless examples show how even sincere reverence can spiral into obsession. A priest may extend ritual beyond sanctioned limits, convinced of deeper insight. An acolyte may manipulate minor psychic currents, believing the Emperor guides each gesture. Every incremental act reinforces a personal narrative of exceptional favor, and each small deviation normalizes behaviors previously deemed heretical. The ethical tension is compounded by perception itself. The warp distorts, suggesting divine will in shadows, whispering guidance that may not exist. Individuals seeking understanding can misattribute these subtle cues to the Emperor. Intent becomes complicated. Devotion and heresy coexist, indistinguishable at first glance. The faithful perceive virtue in acts that, under doctrine, are dangerous. This moral ambiguity is not a flaw of the Imperium but a reflection of human nature, magnified by cosmic forces beyond comprehension. Authority remains a critical factor. The Ecclesiarchy enforces boundaries, correcting transgressions through ritual, penance, or confinement. Yet moral complexity arises when oversight collides with personal conviction. Is obedience to hierarchy always the highest virtue, or does moral agency demand acting on perceived truth even when it contradicts doctrine? Histories of the Imperium show priests, space marines, and psychers whose devotion led them to interpret visions as mandates, sometimes saving lives, sometimes precipitating calamity. Comparisons outside the 40K universe illuminate these tensions. Human history is filled with figures who, inspired by faith, transcended ordinary understanding yet challenged orthodoxy. Mystics, prophets, and zealots acted with conviction, often in isolation, convinced of divine favor. Some guided nations or inspired generations. Others caused strife or tragedy. The pattern mirrors the im-pure-e-im. Devotion unchecked can be a source of greatness or destruction. Context, guidance, and humility determine outcome. Cinematic imagery underscores these stakes. Imagine a vast cathedral at dusk, light filtering through stained glass, dust motes dancing in beams. A priest kneels, hands extended toward a golden statue of the Emperor. The warp's subtle currents brush the edges of perception. Shadows flicker unnaturally. Faint whispers seem to affirm each gesture. Every movement, every incantation, is devotion made tangible. Yet risk is present. One misstep, one subtle bend in ritual, and the line between pious reverence and dangerous obsession blurs. Even the most disciplined warriors confront these dilemmas. Space Marines, trained for obedience, experience similar trials. Visions, battlefield omens, and psychic impressions offer guidance but can distort judgment. Acting upon them may achieve victories or protect lives, yet it can also undermine doctrine. The ethical question persists. When does insight become arrogance? When does devotion justify deviation from strict command? The implications extend beyond individuals. Entire communities may follow leaders convinced of exceptional insight. A single act of heresy, justified by devotion, can ripple through a hive or a chapter, influencing countless lives. The Imperium itself is shaped by this tension. Faith sustains unity and purpose, yet carries inherent risk. Oversight, doctrine, and vigilance are indispensable, yet cannot entirely prevent moral challenges posed by extreme zeal. From these reflections, a lesson: devotion is essential but fragile. It can inspire, guide, and protect, yet it can mislead, isolate, and corrupt. Moral discernment, awareness of influence, and humility are as vital as ritual, doctrine, and hierarchy. The faithful must navigate the precarious boundary between reverence and obsession, lest the warp and the lure of forbidden knowledge transform devotion into peril. The im-pure-e-um, vast and unyielding, thrives on devotion yet must constantly temper it with oversight. By grasping the delicate balance of faith, morality, and authority, one can perceive both the might and the peril woven into devotion. The path of the faithful is bathed in light and shadow alike, a testament to the enduring struggle between loyalty, insight, and the ever-present threat of heresy. Across the vast and unyielding expanse of the Imperium, devotion binds billions and fuels both triumph and disaster. Faith in the Emperor sustains worlds, guides warriors, and inspires citizens to endure hardships beyond mortal comprehension. Yet the same devotion carries within it the seeds of danger, obsession, misinterpretation, and the subtle seduction of forbidden knowledge. The balance between reverence and heresy has shaped life within the Imperium for millennia, defining the challenge each soul must face. History is filled with stories that reveal this delicate equilibrium. On remote hive worlds, acolytes stretch ritual beyond sanctioned limits, explore minor psychic techniques, or claim personal insight into the Emperor's will. Acts that begin as devotion gradually bend perception and behavior, shaped by the unseen currents of the warp. The warp, ever-present and elusive, amplifies ambition and curiosity, blinding the faithful to the consequences of minor deviations. Sincere devotion, unchecked, can grow into obsession and eventually tip into heresy. The guidance of the Ecclesiarchy and other authorities is essential. Through correction, admonishment, confinement, and penance, they maintain order and prevent devotion from turning destructive. Yet oversight alone is not enough. Self-awareness, humility, and moral discernment are equally vital. Even the most disciplined priests, acolytes, space marines, and psychers can falter. Devotion is fragile, demanding constant vigilance. A colossal cathedral crowns the hive spire, sunlight cutting through fractured stained glass, casting golden, crimson, and violet patterns across stone floors. Shadows stretch around kneeling acolytes and hooded priests, while incense smoke spirals thick and heady through the air. A statue of the emperor radiates an almost tangible light, touching the faces of the faithful. Some are wrapped in reverence, hands lifted in prayer. Others, eyes glimmering with ambition or whispered insight, teeter on the edge of obsession. The scene embodies devotion itself, majestic and inspiring, yet shadowed by ever-present danger. Case studies repeat across worlds. A minor acolyte's private prayers become secret rituals. A chaplain interprets battlefield omens and escalates into unsanctioned psychic rites. A congregation drawn to forbidden texts warps slowly under subtle influence. In every instance, the warp acts as an unseen force, magnifying obsession and tempting with forbidden knowledge. The Imperium's history horrors heresy, chaos cults, and isolated extremes carries constant warnings. Faith is a path to power, but the boundary between loyalty and heresy is fragile. Philosophical and moral questions deepen the picture. Devotion is virtuous, yet ambition, personal interpretation, or the lure of forbidden knowledge can warp the ethical compass. Even acts performed with pure intent can carry unforeseen consequences, transforming worship into a channel for corruption. Obedience to doctrine clashes with moral agency, demanding vigilance, discernment, and humility at every level. Faith is both power and responsibility. Devotion illuminates, guides, and inspires, but it can also blind, distort, and corrupt. The warp, forbidden knowledge, and unchecked zeal remind all that strength lies not only in obedience but in recognizing the limits of loyalty. Navigating these boundaries is the challenge each citizen, priest, and warrior faces. High above a hive city, the emperor's light spills across spires, streets, and crowded plazas. Shadows of kneeling acolytes stretch and twist. One figure raises a hand in reverence, then seems to vanish into the darkness, leaving only the echo of devotion behind. Light and shadow entwine, illustrating the paradox of worship. Faith can elevate and inspire, yet the same devotion can slip into obsession, leaving cautionary traces. This is the Imperium itself, built on devotion, balancing illumination and shadow, loyalty and the threat of heresy. From history, case studies, and philosophical reflection, one truth is clear: the line between devotion and heresy is fragile. Preserved by vigilance, oversight, and moral clarity, respecting doctrine while nurturing sincere reverence, remaining aware of the warp's subtle temptations, and exercising wisdom are essential for survival. The Emperor's light guides, yet each soul must navigate the shadows it casts, ensuring faith remains a force of unity, not a pathway to ruin. The story of devotion within the Imperium continues. Every acolyte, priest, and warrior enters a world illuminated by faith but shadowed by temptation. Every choice, prayer, or ritual shapes not only the individual but the fate of countless worlds. Devotion is sacred, heresy is perilous, and the line between them is drawn by vigilance, wisdom, and the ever-watchful guidance of the Emperor.